June 23, 1972, Nixon met with the then CIA Director Richard Helms at the White House. During the conversation, which thankfully was tape recorded, Nixon suggested he knew, quote, who shot John, meaning President John F. Kennedy. Nixon further implied that the CIA was directly involved in Kennedy's assassination, which we now know it was. On June 19th, the Washington Post had published the first of many stories about a break-in at the Watergate office building. Unbeknownst to Nixon and unreported by the Washington Post, 4 of the 5 burglars worked for the CIA. Nixon got 17 million more votes than his opponent. Less than 2 years later, he was gone. He was forced to resign, and in his place, an obedient servant of the federal agencies called Gerald Ford took over the White House. How did that happen?
What's up, guys? It's your boy Benny. Who actually runs your government? Well, we the people, right? Isn't that what it says on the old document? Isn't that what King George saw that made him so angry and had him send all the redcoats over because he threw his tea into the harbor or something? Yeah. The reason why we threw tea into the harbor actually during the Revolutionary War was because we the people didn't run anything. King George's aristocracy, typically landed aristocracy born into privilege, unelected, that ran everything. The divine right to rule. And these people owned your life, controlled you. You had no rights, and they did anything they wanted to you. And it was often brutal, bloody, and awful. It was absolute and total tyranny. And so taxation without representation became the calling card for the American Revolution because we were paying taxes and we had absolutely no say in anything that was happening. Fast forward to today. Do you have any say in what's going on? In fact, does your vote even matter? That's a great question. And as detailed recently by Tucker Carlson in his People's History of the United States of America, it is becoming more and more clear that even our votes don't matter. Now, we're not trying to blackpill anyone. America is always worth saving and worth fighting for, but it is important to actually understand the history of what's happened to all of us. Recently, Tucker Carlson went in hard against the permanent state in Washington, D.C., and their ability to remove presidents at will. Their ability to essentially remove some of the most important and popular people ever elected. In fact, Richard Nixon was the most popular president ever. I know it seems shocking today through the long lens of history and through all the psyops and all of the fake news, but Richard Nixon won re-election by 17 million votes. Richard Nixon was far and away the most popular president ever elected. He won, I think, 49 states. And so what happened to him? Well, Tucker Carlson detailed in absolute stunning, vivid relief how the permanent state in Washington, D.C. actually set Nixon up. How the people who raided the Watergate, famously, were agents of the CIA. And how the reporters who were being fed information by the FBI were actually also themselves, not really reporters, and probably agents of the same federal establishment that wished to get rid of Richard Nixon. Why? Well, because he questioned who killed John F. Kennedy. Insane stuff. Tucker Carlson, take it away.
So if you want to understand, if you really want to understand how the American government actually works at the highest levels, and if you want to know why they don't teach history anymore, one thing you should know is that the most popular president in American history was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon. Yet somehow, without a single vote being cast by a single American voter, Richard Nixon was kicked out of office and replaced by the only unelected president in American history. So we went from the most popular president to a president nobody voted for. Wait a minute, you may ask. Why didn't I know that? Wasn't Richard Nixon a criminal? Wasn't he despised by all decent people? No, he wasn't. In fact, if any president could claim to be the people's choice, it was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was reelected in 1972 by the largest margin of the popular vote ever recorded before or since. Nixon got 17 million more votes than his opponent. Less than 2 years later, he was gone. He was forced to resign, and in his place, an obedient servant of the federal agencies called Gerald Ford took over the White House. Richard Nixon believed that elements in the federal bureaucracy were working to undermine the American system of government, and had been doing that for a long time. He often said that. He was absolutely right. On June 23, 1972, Nixon met with the then CIA Director Richard Helms at the White House. During the conversation, which thankfully was tape recorded, Nixon suggested he knew, quote, who shot John, meaning President John F. Kennedy. Nixon further implied that the CIA was directly involved in Kennedy's assassination, which we now know it was. Helms's telling response? Total silence. But for Nixon, it didn't matter because it was already over. 4 days before, on June 19th, the Washington Post had published the first of many stories about a break-in at the Watergate office building. Unbeknownst to Nixon and unreported by the Washington Post, 4 of the 5 burglars worked for the CIA. The first of many dishonest Watergate stories was written by a 29-year-old Metro reporter called Bob Woodward. Who exactly was Bob Woodward? Well, he wasn't a journalist. Bob Woodward had no background whatsoever in the news business. Instead, Bob Woodward came directly from the classified areas of the federal government. Shortly before Watergate, Woodward was a naval officer at the Pentagon. He had a top-secret clearance. He worked regularly with the intel agencies. At times, Woodward was even detailed to the Nixon White House, where he interacted with Richard Nixon's top aides. Soon after leaving the Navy, for reasons that have never been clear, Woodward was hired by the most powerful news outlet in Washington and assigned the biggest story in the country. And just to make it crystal clear what was actually happening, Woodward's main source for his Watergate series was the deputy director of the FBI, Mark Felt. And Mark Felt ran, and we're not making this up, the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which was designed to secretly discredit political actors the federal agencies wanted to destroy, people like Richard Nixon. And at the same time, those same agencies were also working to take down Nixon's elected vice president, Spiro Agnew. In the fall of 1973, Agnew was indicted for tax evasion and forced to resign. His replacement was a colorless congressman from Grand Rapids called Gerald Ford. What was Ford's qualification for the job? Well, he had served on the Warren Commission, which absolved the CIA of responsibility for President Kennedy's murder. Nixon was strong-armed into accepting Gerald Ford by Democrats in Congress. Quote, "We gave Nixon no choice but Ford," Speaker of the House Carl Albert later boasted. 8 months later, Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission was the President of the United States. See how that works? So those are the facts, not speculation. All of that actually happened. None of it's secret. Most of it actually is on Wikipedia. But no mainstream news organization has ever told that story. It's so obvious, yet it's intentionally ignored. And as a result, permanent Washington remains in charge of our political system. Unelected lifers in the federal agencies make the biggest decisions in American government and crush anyone who tries to rein them in. And in the process, our democracy becomes a joke. Now, you may have noticed that the very first person in the Trump administration the agencies went after was General Michael Flynn. Why Flynn? Because Mike Flynn was a career Army intel officer who ran the Defense Intelligence Agency. In other words, Mike Flynn knew exactly how the system worked, and as a result, he was capable of fighting back. 4 days after Donald Trump's inauguration, the FBI lured Mike Flynn into a meeting without his lawyer, concocted a series of fake crimes, and forced him to resign. So that's how things actually work in Washington. Let's stop lying about it. Joe Biden is someone who had access to these still hidden CIA documents. The person was deeply familiar with what they contained. We asked this person directly, did the CIA have a hand in the murder of John F. Kennedy, an American president? And here's the reply we received verbatim. Quote, "The answer is yes. I believe they were involved. It's a whole different country from what we thought it was. It's all fake." It's hard to imagine a more jarring response than that. Again, this is not a, quote, conspiracy theorist that we spoke to. Not even close. This is someone with direct knowledge of the information that once again is being withheld from the American public.
So what if everything you thought about your federal government was a lie? I mean, have you ever taken a, chance to really ponder that? What if the world that you believe you live in, a democracy, a republic you think you live in, actually isn't controlled by you at all? What if you're right back to King George level shackles, taxation without representation? What if there's a group of people who established a government above your government and outside of your democratic control?
The war on David from the Confederacy.
Let me know in the comment section if you found this video
Dick Cheney. You are a Republican from Wyoming. I'd like to ask you, how should Congress handle the Iran arms-Contra connection situation?
Well, there are several key issues involved here, it seems to me. First of all is the fact that there are statutes that are on the books or were on the books at the time that this operation took place, and questions have been raised about whether or not there was a violation of those statutes. That automatically will lead to investigations by the intelligence committees, for example, of both bodies who have jurisdiction over intelligence operations, and this was an intelligence operation. There are likely to be investigations into the policy ramifications of it. The House Foreign Affairs Committee, for example, is interested in the policy consequences of dealing with the Iranians. And there may well be questions asked about arms transfers. The Defense Department's involved. Anytime you talk about 2,000 anti-tank missiles, those came out of Defense Department stocks, so the Armed Services Committee may want to get into it. All of those kinds of issues are there, and it seems to me Congress at this point has an obligation not to interfere with the workings of the presidency, but when something this controversial develops, then the committees have to go exercise their oversight responsibilities, a constitutional role, if you will, to review the functioning of the executive branch, review the function of the agencies and key people therein, and determine whether or not the will and desire of the American people has been carried out.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to our viewer call, and our guest again, as you may have guessed, Congressman Dick Cheney, a Republican from Wyoming. We'd like for you to call us. We're going to be talking about how Congress should handle the situation with the Iran arms deal and the money that went to the Contras. The numbers to call: Eastern Central time zones, if you're in those time zones, area code 202-628-2525. If you're living in the Pacific or Mountain time zones, area code 202-783-2727. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our guest while you're dialing the phone. He is chairman of the Republican Policy Committee, elected in 1978. He was elected chairman of that committee in 81. Let's see, you were elected to your office in 78. You were elected to the Policy Committee in 1981. He was the White House Chief of Staff of the Ford administration from November of 75 to January of 77, and Deputy Assistant to the President, and a Congressional Fellow at the American Political Science Foundation. Congressman, do you think that Congress is going to jump on this like a raw piece of meat, or like they seem to want to, or are they going to take a slow, calm look at this?
I certainly would hope it would be a slow, calm look, Judalyn. I would hope that nobody will seek any partisan advantage out of this. It seems to me that all Americans suffer when the presidency is in difficulty, and clearly the administration today is in some hot water, and we need to get that sorted out and get to the bottom of it as quickly as possible. Certainly there probably are some members of Congress who perhaps take some delight in the current difficulties that the president faces, but I would hope not. I think what's called for here is calm, deliberate consideration of the issues. The issues the president was involved with in connection with the Iranian initiative are very serious ones. The question of American hostages, very serious problem. I personally am a strong supporter of the president's policies with respect to the Contras. I believe we ought to support the Contras. The question arises here whether or not the transfer of funds to the Contras occurred at a time when the Bolen Amendment was on the books, and the Bolen Amendment prohibited any U.S. government assistance going to the Contras. So we have an obligation, it seems to me, to see to it that the laws are fully and fairly enforced, but I would hope that we do it in a way that is responsible and statesmanlike rather than one that's dominated by partisan considerations. Or yesterday, just this weekend, that perhaps we ought to create a joint select committee that is made up of members of both houses and both parties to look at it. I think there is merit in the argument of going with a special committee. I believe it's very important that we get this matter resolved as soon as possible. I think from the president's standpoint, it's in his interest to have it resolved and behind us. He only has 2 years left in office, and if we have 8 or 10 committees crawling all over one another's turf, trying to investigate it, looking at the same papers and trying to subpoena the same witnesses and hold the same hearings, and it seems to me that's a very inefficient way to proceed and will send very confusing and conflicting signals to the country. I think Congress can do a better job, and I think the administration probably would prefer it if we had just 1 or 2 focal points up here on the Hill, maybe a special committee in the House and one in the Senate, or a joint committee that could deal with it. But that's an issue that's as yet unresolved. It's really a decision that ultimately gets made by the Speaker and the Majority Leader in the Senate, and they have yet to be heard from on the case.
And you would have to call a special session, would you not, to get the committees together?
Either that or wait until January. The only reason you would have to do a special session now, of course, is because Congress adjourned sine die in October before
And
the
that
elections.
means?
Adjourned sine die means that was the end of the 99th Congress. So we don't have the power to come back into session and create this joint commission, for example, unless the president were to call us back into special session. He has that constitutional authority. Then we could come back in and create a joint commission or joint committee. The other option, of course, is simply to wait until January to let the standing committees, like the Intelligence Committee, for example, go forward with their investigations now. When the new Congress, the 100th Congress, convenes January 6th, would be a time when we could then decide how we wanted to proceed. But that's the debate that's currently unresolved and is raging between the parties and members of Congress and the House and the Senate, and also the administration. Nobody has really come down firmly on it other than Senator Dole.
Okay.
They got 52 million votes. And, but I don't think the opposition in Congress really done anything until after the 84 election. I think then the leaders of the Democratic Party, they made up their mind. They were going to obstruct President Reagan on every move that he made in foreign policy. And one of the things they did was they made up their mind they didn't want to give him any appropriation to help the Contras in Nicaragua. And of course, $100 million, from what I've read and heard, is absolutely nothing. And the Democratic chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, Les Aspin, I read where Reagan, or Mr. O'Neill, wanted to, he made sure, he said he didn't want him reappointed when he steps out, Jim Wright takes over, he's out, because he voted for aid to the Contras. Now that's the kind of opposition we have in the House, and I think it's time the American people have somebody who knows how to set it up so that the President of the United States is not going to be stopped from exercising his office. Look what they did in the Senate. Look what Biden and several others in the Senate tried to do for his 2 Supreme Court appointments. If they had their way, he wouldn't be able to appoint a judge to the Supreme Court. And something's got to be done in this country. 52 million people wanted Reagan, and they wanted him to have some authority. Now, I'll close by saying that I think before Carter came in, we had the Shah, and we knew everything that was going on the borderline there, which is Russia. And, of course, due to Carter's mishandling of the situation in Iran, today we have the Khomeini, who is 86 years of age. He's sick, and according to what I read, he could pass out at any time. And if he does, the way the situation is there today, you could have either a civil war or a revolution. And I can readily see why the president or whoever did it, they ought to get a gold medal to try and get the door open to Iran.
Sir, thank you very much. Please let the congressman respond to what you've said already. Go ahead, sir.
And thank you very much for your call and your question. In the House, we have a 5-minute rule, and we often get cut off that way, too, since we're required to limit our remarks. I don't want to be overly partisan, but I do think that there has been a tendency for a majority of the members of the Democratic Party in the House, especially, to oppose the president, especially on his Central American policies. Reasonable men and women can disagree on the merits of various policies and proposals, but I think there's no question about it. The facts, as you state them with respect to Les Aspin, are true. Mr. Aspin is a man who is the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the House. He did, after he took a trip to Nicaragua, decide that instead of opposing the president on aid to the Contras, that he wanted to support the president. He voted that way last time around, and now he has been criticized by a large number of his colleagues within his own party for that action, specifically the former Speaker O'Neill, of course, who's about to retire. But I think the key question in terms of whether or not the president's initiative towards Iran was a sound one is of course, a subject of much debate. I was had the opportunity to go down and be briefed by the President on that initiative when it first became public. There's no question in my mind but what he felt very strongly about the importance of trying to open up some kind of dialogue with not so much Khomeini, but rather with those elements in the Iranian society that might succeed. You're correct, the Ayatollah is an old man, he's very sick, he's not likely to survive much longer. The possibility exists that you could have civil war or an effort by the Soviets to intervene in Iran at that point when he passes from the scene. So I think the President's desire was well-founded. The question that everybody has raised isn't so much the wisdom of that initiative as it is the question of, first of all, of trading arms to the Iranians and in return asking them to send hostages to us. The President argues that that wasn't a swap. I think technically he's correct in saying that the people who were holding the hostages were not dealt with directly by the administration and did not receive any of the weapons. But still, this argument of the perception of a swap is what's created a lot of controversy. And of course, the other big problem that's now developed is the information that some of those funds were diverted to support the Contras. So that's what the controversy is all about. It seems to me we ought to be able to have good policy debate in this country, and I think we would over the Iranian portion of it. The argument now, though, has gone beyond that, and the administration itself, of course, is concerned because the President's asked the Attorney General to conduct an investigation, and now we're looking at the issue of whether or not anybody violated any statutes in carrying out that operation, and that's what we'll find out in the next few months.
Seattle, Washington, go ahead, please.
Well, I just called in full support of Mr. Reagan. I'm not sure that I agree with how he handled the Iran end of it. He did what he thought was right. I don't have enough information to know whether he was right or wrong, but he did what he thought was right. I'm in full support of the Contras. I think more people ought to listen to Mr. Aspen after being there and enough to sway him to a 180-degree turn in his attitude and in support of it. And I think more of the President's constituents should stand up and quit sitting back and waiting to see what effect this is going to have in their office and stand up and say what's right is right and say because Congress has tied their hands, they had to go under the table to do something. That's all. I'm full support of Mr. Reagan.
Thank you for your call.
Your question.
Yes, I'd like to ask Representative Cheney, do the Republicans really understand the Constitution, the system of checks and balances? This smells of Watergate to me. Mr. Nixon denied everything. Mr. Reagan's denying everything. This is the same Rambo Reagan that's cruised around the country in 1980 chastising Jimmy Carter for his handling of the Iranian situation. And I'd like one more question. Is it true that Teflon only lasts 6 years, Representative Cheney? Thank you.
It's a nice bipartisan comment. Well, first of all, I think your facts are wrong. I would again remind you of something I mentioned earlier in the show. Maybe you just tuned in. The fact that funds were diverted and provided to the Contras is something that was made available to the public, put out on the record at the direction of the President. He has not been engaged in any kind of cover-up, as you suggested, or that taken any action that, quote, smacks of Watergate. That's simply not true. So far, the President has been as aggressive as anybody, perhaps more aggressive than anybody, in pursuing the truth in this matter. He's the man who made the decision to let go Admiral Poindexter and Colonel North. He's the one who directed the Attorney General to undertake an immediate investigation. He's the one who's indicated that his administration will cooperate fully with congressional investigations. And as I say, he's the one who made public the knowledge that the information that in fact there had been a diversion of funds here. So I think to somehow draw a parallel between his situation and the situation of President Nixon at Watergate simply indicates an ignorance of what's happened.
Dallas, Texas, go ahead.
From the reports observed in many of the subordinate records, there were men who released the information about the Iran-Contras, and they were, from the assumption, fully punished, and the only ones who got punished, the coverman for Reagan, from diffused responsibility programs such as plausible deniability subversion protocols, took all of the blame, and he received a minimum amount of punishment along with full recoveries and promotions. And the ones who received the punishment were the ones that forced Reagan's hand into releasing the information. On that basis, the conflicting reports are a basis of researching the histories specifically, which may be done at a later date, as I do not currently have them on hand to report.